Alright, guys, we have to finish this story because it is so good. And at the end of this text, it mentions the Pharaoh of the time was Pharaoh Ankhed, spelled Anked. Now, when I Google Pharaoh Ankhed, I get nothing. I went through the list of pharaohs that are known. It is not there. Unless I missed it or someone knows something I don't, please share with me so that we can know when this took place. But I could not find anything about Pharaoh Ankhed except for this text. Let's finish the story. There were 9 days of darkness and upheaval, while a tempest raged such as has never been known before. When it passed away, brother buried brother throughout the land. Men rose up against those in authority and fled from the cities to dwell in tents in the outlands. Egypt lacked great men to deal with the times. The people were weak from fear and bestowed gold, silver, lapis, lazuli, turquoise, and copper upon the slaves. And to their priests they gave chalices, urns, and ornaments. Pharaoh alone remained calm and strong in the midst of confusion. The people turned to wickedness in their weakness and despair. Harlots walked through the streets unashamed. Women paraded their limbs and flaunted their womanly charms. High-born women were in rags, and the virtuous were mocked. The slaves spared by the destroyer left the accursed land forthwith. Their multitude moved in the gloom of a half-dawn, under a mantle of fine swirling gray ash, leaving the burnt fields and shattered cities behind them. Many Egyptians attached themselves to the host, for one who was great led them forth, a priest prince of the inner courtyard. Fire mounted up on high, and its burning left with the enemies of Egypt. It rose up from the ground as a fountain and hung as a curtain in the sky. And guys, this is the thunderbolts of the gods. In 7 days, the rim war, the accursed ones journeyed to the waters. They crossed the heaving wilderness, while the hills melted around them. Above, the skies were torn with lightning. They were sped by terror. But their feet became entangled in the land, and the wilderness shut them in. They knew not the way, for no sign was constant before them. They turned before Noshari and stopped at Shakoth, the place of quarries. They passed the waters of Maha and came by the valleys of Pikaroth, northward of Mara. They came up against the waters which blocked their way, and their hearts were in despair. The night was a night of fear and dread, for there was a high moaning above, and black winds from the underworld were loosed, and fire sprang up from the ground. The hearts of the slaves shrank within them, for they knew the wrath of Pharaoh followed them, and that there was no way of escape. They hurled abuse on those who led them. Strange rites were performed along the shore that night. The slaves disputed among themselves, and there was violence. Pharaoh had gathered his army and followed the slaves. After he departed, there were riots and disorders behind him, for the cities were plundered. The laws were cast out of the judgment halls and trampled underfoot in the streets. The storehouses and granaries were burst open and robbed. Roads were flooded, and none could pass along them. People lay dead on every side. The palace was split, and the princes and officials fled, so that none was left with authority to command. The list of numbers were destroyed. Public places were overthrown, and households became confused and unknown. Pharaoh pressed on in sorrow, for behind him was all desolation and death. Before him were things he could not understand, and he was afraid, but he carried himself well and stood before his host with courage. He sought to bring back the slaves, for the people said their magic was greater than the magic of Egypt. The host of Pharaoh came upon the slaves by the saltwater shores, but was held back from them by a breath of fire. A great cloud was spread over the host and darkened the sky. None could see except for the fiery glow and the unceasing lightnings which rent the covering cloud overhead. A whirlwind arose in the east and swept over the encamped hosts. A gale raged all night, and in the red twilight dawn there was a movement of the earth. The waters receded from the seashore and were rolled back on themselves. There was a strange silence in men. In the gloom, it was seen that the waters had parted, leaving a passage between. The land had risen, but it was disturbed and trembled. The way was not straight or clear. The waters about were as if spun within a bowl. The swampland alone remained undisturbed. From the horn of the destroyer came a high shrilling noise which stopped the ears of men. The slaves had been making sacrifices in despair. Their lamentations were loud. Now, before the strange sight, there was hesitation and doubt. For the space of a breath they stood still and silent. Then all was confusion and shouting, some pressing forward into the waters against all who sought to flee back from the unstable ground. Then, in exultation, their leader led them into the midst of the waters through the confusion. Yet many sought to turn back into the host behind them, while others fled along the empty shores. All became still over the sea and upon the shore, but behind, the earth shook and boulders split with a great noise. The wrath of heaven was removed to a distance and stood upwards of the two hosts. Still the host of Pharaoh held its ranks, firm in resolve before the strange and awful happenings, and undaunted by the fury which raged by their side. Stern faces were lit darkly by the fiery curtain. Then the fury departed and there was silence. Stillness spread over the land while the host of Pharaoh stood without movement in the red glow. And then with a shout the captains went forward and the host rose up behind them. The curtain of fire had rolled up into a dark billowing cloud which spread out as a canopy. There was a stirring of the waters, but they followed the evildoers past the place of the great whirlpool. The passage was confused in the midst of the waters, and the ground beneath unstable. Here, in the midst of a tumult of waters, Pharaoh fought against the hindmost of the slaves and prevailed over them. And there was a great slaughter amid the sand, the swamp, and the water. The slaves cried out in despair, but their eyes were unheeded. Their possessions were scattered behind them as they fled, so that the way was easier for them than for those who followed. Then the stillness was broken by a mighty roar, and through the rolling pillars of cloud, the wrath of the destroyer descended upon the hosts. The heavens roared as with 1,000 thunders. The bowels of the earth were sundered, and earth shrieked its agony. The cliffs were torn away and cast down. The dry ground fell beneath the waters, and great waves broke upon the shore, sweeping in rocks from seaward. The great surge of rocks and waters overwhelmed the chariots of the Egyptians who went before the footmen. The chariot of the Pharaoh was hurled into the air as if by a mighty hand and was crushed in the midst of the rolling waters. Tidings of the disaster came back to Ragab, son of Thomat, who hastened on ahead of the terrified survivors because of his burning. He brought reports unto the people that the host had been destroyed by blast and deluge. The captains had gone. The strong men had fallen, and none remained to command. Therefore the people revolted because of the calamities which had befallen them. Cowards slunk from their lairs and came forth boldly to assume the high offices of the dead. Comely and noble women, their protectors gone, were their prey. Of the slaves, the greater number had perished before the host of Pharaoh. The broken land lay helpless, and invaders came out of the gloom like carrion. Strange people came up against Egypt, and none stood to fight, for strength and courage were gone. The invaders, led by Alcanan, came up out of the land of gods because of the wrath of heaven, which had laid their land waste. There too had been a plague of reptiles and ants, signs and omens, and an earthquake. There also had been turmoil and disaster, disorder and famine, with the great breath of the destroyer sweeping the ground and stopping the breath of men. And Terah gathered together the remnants of his fighting men, and the fighting men who were left in Egypt, and set forth to meet the children of darkness who came out of the eastern mountains by way of the wilderness, and by way of Yethnobus. They fell upon the stricken land from behind the great cloud, before the lifting of the darkness and before the coming of the purifying winds. Ragab went with Pharaoh and met the invaders at Harosheth, but the hearts of the Egyptians were faint within them. Their spirits were no longer strong, and they fell away before the battle was lost. Deserted by the gods above and below, their dwellings destroyed, their households scattered. They were as men already half dead. Their hearts were still filled with terror and the memory of the wrath which had struck them from out of heaven. They were still filled with the memory of the fearsome sight of the destroyer, and they knew not what they did. Pharaoh did return to his city. He lost his heritage and was seized by a demon for many days. His women were polluted and his estates plundered. The children of darkness defiled the temples with rams and ravished women who were crazed and did not resist. They enslaved all who were left, the old, young men, and boys. They oppressed the people, and their delight was in mutilation and torture. Pharaoh abandoned his hopes and fled into the wilderness beyond the province of the lake, which is in the west towards the south. He lived a goodly life among the sand wanderers and wrote books. Good times came again, even under the invaders, and ships sailed upstream. The air was purified, the breath of the destroyer passed away, and the land became filled again with growing things. Life was renewed throughout the whole land. Cair taught these things to the children of light in the days of darkness, after the building of the Rambudeth, before the death of the Pharaoh Ankhed. This is written in this land and in our tongue by Lawadar, who himself chose it for saving. It was not seen until the later days. And so, guys, if you made it this far, thank you. And this text is just amazing. This is the true version of what happened. And the Jews, the slaves, were the lucky survivors that went on to rampage and murder an entire region of people and give their twisted version of events that would later serve as a control system for their people. And this text is simply amazing that we have from eyewitnesses of the cataclysm. And if anyone knows who in the hell Pharaoh Ankhed is, or has any information about him, please share so that we can date this event. Thanks for watching, guys. Have a good night.